call came out of nowhere, right in the middle of a quiet Friday evening. "Come to the cabin," she said, her voice warm, yet carrying a hint of mystery. "The weather's perfect, and I thought you might enjoy a change of scenery. Bring your friend too." I hesitated. I don't usually visit my stepmother one-on-one, and an invitation to her secluded cabin felt odd, to say the least. But something about her tone tugged at me, and I figured a little getaway wouldn't hurt. I messaged my friend with the plan, and an hour later, we were navigating the old forest road, the dense trees closing in as the daylight began to fade. By the time we arrived, the cabin looked like a hidden retreat, far from our usual lives. She was already on the porch, waiting with a friendly smile. In a casual outfit that matched the rustic surroundings, she greeted us warmly, surprising me with her ease. "Glad you both could make it," she said, motioning for us to come inside. The cabin's cozy atmosphere immediately felt like stepping into another world. The walls were lined with old books and quirky trinkets, making it seem as if time had slowed down there. She poured us each a cup of tea, and we settled into casual conversation as the evening turned into night. "I thought we could have some fun tonight," she said, breaking the silence. Her eyes sparkled with a playful curiosity as she reached behind a stack of books and pulled out an old, dusty box. The label was nearly unreadable, but I recognized it right away. A board game I hadn't played since childhood. "Really? This game?" I laughed, surprised by her choice. My friend raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by the idea of a game night. "It's been forever since I played this," she said with a grin, her voice soft but full of excitement. "I thought it might be a nice change," she continued, "something to get us talking and laughing. Plus, it's not every day I get company out here. What do you think?" Though it felt a bit out of place, her enthusiasm was infectious. My friend and I exchanged a look and shrugged, deciding, why not? We moved to the large table near the fireplace, setting up the game while she sat across from us, a mischievous gleam in her eye. "Let's add a twist," she suggested once we were all settled. "How about every time someone loses, they have to do a dare? Nothing too crazy, just something to keep things interesting." I hesitated for a moment, but her smile was reassuring, and it felt silly to refuse. My friend seemed unsure too, but nodded along. The first few rounds were light-hearted, full of laughter and small challenges. Things like telling a funny story or acting out a random movie scene. Then she lost a round, and when I jokingly asked what her dare would be, she paused, considering. "All right," she said, eyes twinkling. "How about I let one of you decide?" The offer seemed innocent enough, but a strange pause hung in the air. My friend and I exchanged glances, and finally, he blurted out, "Okay, how about you give one of us a kiss on the cheek?" She laughed, raising her eyebrows at the unexpected dare, but then shrugged. "All right, if that's what you want." She leaned over and gave my friend a quick, playful peck on the cheek, then settled back as if nothing had happened. It was a small gesture, but somehow it felt like a ripple in the otherwise calm, cozy atmosphere. We continued the game, but as we laughed and faced each new challenge, I couldn't help but notice how the cabin seemed to cocoon us, shutting out everything else. It was like we'd stepped into a little bubble where the usual rules didn't apply. After a few more rounds, I lost, and she turned to me with a smile that almost felt like a challenge. "All right, your turn," she said lightly. "What's your dare?" Caught off guard, I stammered, trying to think of something that matched the playful mood. "Okay, tell us the most embarrassing thing you've ever done," I said, laughing to cover up my own nervousness. Her eyes gleamed as she leaned back, contemplating. "Oh, I've got a few stories," she said with a chuckle. "But let's just say, one time, I walked into the wrong cabin during a trip and spent 15 minutes chatting with a family of strangers before I realized I wasn't in my own place. I've never run out of a room so fast," she added, and we all burst into laughter. The tension of earlier seemed to fade away, replaced by a comfortable warmth. Yet, beneath the surface, I could feel something unspoken hanging in the air, a quiet charge that grew as the game went on. As the night deepened, the crackling fire and soft murmurs of conversation wrapped us in a cozy silence, interrupted only by our laughter and the occasional clink of teacups. But as I glanced around at my friend and then at her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like a subtle current was pulling us toward something we couldn't quite name. Though we didn't say it aloud, I could tell we all felt it. An invisible line had been crossed, and it left us wondering what the rest of the night would bring. As the fire crackled and the dim light filled the cabin, the air felt heavier. We were more invested in the game than I could have imagined. The cabin's cozy atmosphere seemed to close in on us, creating a sense of shared anticipation. My stepmother, with her slight, knowing smile, appeared to savor every moment, every little reaction from us. It was as if she were somehow steering the game, knowing exactly what each of us was thinking. A few more rounds passed, filled with harmless stares and funny stories, and soon it was her turn to lose again. She grinned, leaning back with her arms crossed. "Okay, let's see what you two come up with for me this time," she said, giving us both a daring look. My friend hesitated, but I blurted out, "How about you share a secret? Something you've never told anyone else." I wasn't sure why I said it, but it felt like a way to add a bit of seriousness to the otherwise playful evening. She raised an eyebrow, as if weighing whether she was ready to reveal something. Finally, she sighed, and her voice softened. "All right," she began, her voice taking on a more reflective tone. "There's a place I go to in my mind. It's this spot in the woods, quiet and far away, when everything around me feels too much. I go there, and for a little while, everything feels distant, like I can let go." The cabin fell silent, her words hanging in the air with surprising weight. I glanced at my friend, who looked just as taken aback as I felt. We were all quiet for a moment, until she shrugged, breaking the tension with a soft laugh, as if to dismiss the heaviness of the moment. "See? Nothing too dramatic," she added, steering the conversation back to the lightheartedness we'd started with. The game resumed, and before long, it was my friend's turn to face a dare. She looked at him, a mischievous gleam in her eye, leaning forward on her elbows. "I dare you to stand outside for a full minute without saying a word. Just listen to the sounds around you." He looked confused but didn't argue. We watched as he stepped out, quietly closing the door behind him, and the silence in the cabin deepened. She turned to me, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. Her gaze lingered a moment longer than usual, and a strange fluttering sensation stirred in my chest. "Your friend?" she murmured, her eyes never leaving mine, as if searching for something unspoken between us. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, feeling both uneasy and intrigued. Then, with calm assurance, she reached out and placed her hand gently on mine. The warmth of her touch caught me off guard, and for a brief second, the whole room seemed to shrink, leaving just the two of us. The moment was fleeting, but it unsettled me before I could think of how to react. The door creaked open, and my friend stepped back inside, wearing a puzzled expression. He looked between us as if sensing something had shifted, but without skipping a beat, she sat up, pulling her hand away and returning to the game with ease. "You're back just in time," she said brightly, her tone light and playful. "All right, looks like it's my turn to lose again," she said, feigning a sigh and tilting her head toward me. "So, what's the next dare?" This time, my friend took charge, though it was clear he was still unsure of the situation. "How about?" he began, then paused, glancing at me for a brief moment before continuing. "How about you give him a kiss on the cheek for good luck in the next round?" I felt my heart race, unsure whether this was just another playful suggestion, or if he sensed the unspoken tension between us. She hesitated, her smile flickering for an instant as she thought it over. Then, with a small shrug, she leaned toward me, her face close enough that I could smell the faint scent of her perfume. The kiss was brief, just a light brush of her lips against my cheek, innocent enough. Yet, it lingered in a way that had nothing to do with the action itself, but everything to do with the feeling it left behind. I held my breath as she pulled back, her eyes meeting mine with a subtle sparkle that made it seem as though she knew exactly what effect that fleeting moment had on me. My friend looked away, scratching his neck awkwardly, clearly aware of the tension that had settled into the room. Just like that, the mood shifted again. We continued with the game, but each roll of the dice, each glance or movement, felt charged with an invisible energy that none of us were willing to address. We played in silence, each of us acutely aware of the others, pretending nothing had changed. As the night wore on, my thoughts grew tangled, and I found myself sneaking glances at her, catching her watching me with that same knowing look. My friend's usual humor had quieted, and his laughter now sounded forced. It was then I realized that he, too, had felt the shift. Finally, the game came to an end, leaving us sitting in silence. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on us like a thick blanket. She gathered the game pieces with delicate hands, as if each one carried secrets she wasn't yet ready to reveal. "Maybe we should call it a night," she murmured softly. The next morning, I woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the cabin's curtains, my mind swirling with confusion and anticipation. My friend and I hadn't said much to each other since last night, but it was clear that we were both still unsettled. What had started as an innocent evening had crossed some unspoken line, and now everything felt strange. My mind replayed the brief, fleeting moments. The look she gave me, the warmth of her hand, the brush of her lips. It all felt surreal. I got up, trying to shake off the strange feelings from the night before, and found my friend already in the kitchen, looking more serious than usual. He didn't mention the previous evening, and we settled into a quiet breakfast, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Just as we were finishing, she walked in, cheerful and at ease, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She wore a casual sweater, her hair pulled back, and greeted us with a warm smile. "Morning, boys," she said, filling her mug with coffee before joining us at the table. Her presence only added to the confusion. It was as if she hadn't noticed the strange atmosphere hanging over the room. "Did you two sleep well?" she asked, her eyes casually sweeping over both of us. My friend mumbled something about the cozy bed, and I just nodded, trying not to meet her gaze. She glanced at the clock, then turned to me with a raised eyebrow. "I was thinking of taking a walk around the lake," she said. "Would either of you like to join me?" My friend hesitated, looking between us before shaking his head. "You go ahead. I think I'll just stick around here, maybe read a bit." There was a hint of awkwardness in his voice, as though he was trying to avoid something he didn't fully understand. So I found myself walking out to the lake with her. The grounds of the cabin were peaceful, the morning mist still hovering over the water's surface. We walked quietly side by side, the only sounds around us being the crunch of gravel beneath our shoes and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. A strange feeling lingered in the air, one I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just a casual walk. It felt like there was something more to it, something heavier. When we reached the edge of the lake, she stopped, her gaze fixed on the water, lost in thought. "You know," she began softly, breaking the silence, "I don't get to come here much. Life always seems to get in the way." Her voice was quiet, almost wistful, and she glanced at me for a brief moment, her face bathed in the soft morning light. "I'm really glad you both came." There was something in her voice when she said it that made my heart skip, a flutter I wasn't expecting. I felt this sudden urge to say something, to tell her how I felt, but the words didn't come. Instead, I just nodded, glancing down at the ground as if I could find something there to steady me. For a moment, I felt like I was 16 again, caught in that awkward space between confusion and excitement. After a beat, she turned to face me, her voice barely audible. "I know last night was a little strange." Her words hung in the air, thick and heavy, and I wasn't sure how to answer. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to make a joke and move past the discomfort, but something in the way she said it made me feel like I needed to understand what she meant. I managed a small smile, trying to deflect the tension. "Yeah, it was different," I said, trying to sound casual, though I could feel my stomach tighten. She paused, her gaze lingering on me with an intensity one hadn't expected. She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "Different doesn't always mean bad," she said, her voice low and soft. As if to punctuate her words, She reached out and lightly brushed my arm with her fingers. The touch was quick, but the warmth from it stayed with me, lingering in a way I couldn't explain. She smiled, a playful glint flashing in her eyes before she stepped back, breaking the moment as suddenly as it had come. We resumed our walk, the conversation shifting to lighter topics: books, movies, and the charm of the cabin itself. But the silence between our words now felt thicker, more palpable, as if we were both aware of something unspoken. When we returned to the cabin, my friend glanced up from his book, his face carefully neutral. She went inside without a word, leaving me on the porch with him. He didn't look at me at first, a frown furrowing his brow as he avoided my gaze. After a moment, he glanced up as if trying to decide whether to say something. "What's going on, man?" he asked, his voice low, as if he was afraid someone else might overhear. "Last night, that was strange, right?" I shrugged, trying to brush it off. "Yeah, I guess it was just a game." He gave me a look that made it clear he wasn't buying it. A game, sure, but it didn't feel like just a game. I didn't know what to say. The silence between us grew heavy, thick with unspoken thoughts. He shook his head, staring off into the distance as if trying to make sense of everything. "I don't know, man. It's just, I don't know." Before I could respond, she came back out, holding a cup of coffee and smiling at us both. "So, what's the plan for today?" she asked, her tone light and casual, like nothing had happened. My friend shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to escape the tension. "I think I'll head into town for a bit," he said, glancing back and forth between us. "Maybe grab some supplies." "Sounds great," she replied, her smile never wavering. "We could use a few things." As he walked down the path to his car, I found myself alone with her again. "Looks like it's just the two of us," she said, her voice carrying a playful undertone. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness, unsure of where the day might lead. With my friend gone, the cabin felt even quieter. The morning light had shifted to a soft, overcast afternoon that settled over the lake and the surrounding trees, creating a stillness that seemed to press in on everything. She leaned against the porch railing, her gaze lingering on the path where my friend had gone. I couldn't shake the sense that something unspoken was hanging just beneath the surface of this silence, waiting to surface. She turned to me with a contemplative look. "It's nice having you both here," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I don't get much company out here. It reminds me of simpler times." I nodded, unsure how to respond, as something almost melancholic colored her tone, like she was reminiscing about something lost. She straightened up, her mood brightening as she suggested, "How about a quick game to pass the time?" At first, I thought she meant the board game from last night, but then she gestured toward a small shelf filled with books. "It's a guessing game," she explained. "We take turns describing a book without giving its title, and the other person has to guess what it is." I agreed, intrigued by the new idea. She picked up the first book, a well-worn novel, and began to describe it. I tried to follow her clues, but I found myself paying more attention to how she spoke, the warmth in her voice, the excitement in her tone as the game unfolded. The conversation became more personal, like each clue was revealing something deeper about who we were. We laughed, shared memories, and the mood lightened. For a while, it felt like the tension from the night before had disappeared. But then, sensing the shift herself, she placed the book back on the shelf, her fingers lingering on its spine. She looked at me, her gaze intense in a way that made my heart beat faster. "You know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something about being out here, away from everything. It's like time just stops." Her eyes locked on mine, and I felt an undeniable pull, unsure of where this was heading. The silence between us thickened, and before I could respond, she stepped closer, her gaze never breaking. Her hand reached up to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear, a tender gesture that felt more intimate than I was ready for. "Sometimes, I think we let too many moments slip away," she murmured, her voice soft and almost melancholic. Before I could process her words, she leaned in, her face close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath on my skin. Her lips brushed against mine, tentative, quick, but enough to send a spark through me. I pulled back, stunned, searching her face for some kind of explanation, but all I found was a calm, almost serene look in her eyes, as if what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to speak, to say something that could break the silence, but nothing came. Instead, I felt drawn back in, like that fleeting touch had awakened something I hadn't even realized was there. She leaned in again, this time with more certainty, her lips meeting mine gently, lingering with an intensity that caught me off guard. The kiss was soft, but its depth was overwhelming. Then, the sound of footsteps on the gravel broke the stillness, and we both pulled away, startled. My friend was back. His face was neutral, but his eyes were sharp, quickly scanning the scene before him. He looked between us, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, realizing how easily I had let myself get carried away. She cleared her throat, regaining her composure, and greeted him with a forced casual smile. "You're back early," she said lightly, though I could hear the faint tremor in her voice. "Yeah," he replied curtly, dropping his bag on the kitchen counter without meeting anyone's gaze. I figured I'd grab a few things and head back. His movements were stiff, like he was trying to occupy himself to avoid confronting what had just happened. The tension in the room was palpable, heavy with the weight of unsaid words. I felt the urge to explain, to offer some sort of excuse, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence between us was thick, filled with unspoken questions, accusations I couldn't answer. Finally, he looked at me, his gaze sharp, and I saw the hurt and confusion swirling in his eyes. "So," he began, his voice steady but low, "what exactly did I just walk into?" I opened my mouth to reply, but she cut me off, her tone calm yet firm. "It's not what you think," she said, though her words sounded hollow, like she was trying to convince herself just as much as him. "We just got caught up in the moment." He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "Caught up in the moment, right?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm not blind, you know." An uncomfortable silence hung in the air, and I felt the weight of regret press down on me. How had things gotten so complicated so quickly? I hadn't planned for any of this, but now, there was no denying that a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be easily undone. She looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry if this made you uncomfortable," she said, her voice almost pleading. "That was never my intention." He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Uncomfortable? That's one way to put it," he replied, his eyes flicking back and forth between us before locking onto her. "I think I'll just take a walk," he muttered, turning and heading for the door, the weight of everything hanging between us as it clicked shut behind him. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she murmured, almost to herself. I stood there, unsure of what to say, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I glanced toward the window, watching him walk down the path, his shoulders hunched, clearly lost in thought. A sense of guilt settled in my chest, heavy, inescapable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let both of them down. She turned to me, her gaze filled with an unfamiliar sadness. "Maybe it's best if we all just take some time to clear our heads," she said softly, regret lacing her voice. I nodded, though I wasn't sure time could heal what had just happened. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence, each of us retreating into our own thoughts. My friend stayed outside, wandering by the lake, his figure small against the backdrop of trees and water. She and I moved around the cabin, avoiding each other's gaze, every step laden with an awkward tension that neither of us knew how to dispel. As evening descended, the sky turning a somber gray, my friend finally returned. His face was unreadable. Without a word, he grabbed his bag and began packing with purpose, his movements quick and deliberate, like he was determined to leave without further conversation. Watching him, I felt the weight of everything that had transpired, bearing down on me. The silence between us thickened with unresolved questions. Things we hadn't said but couldn't avoid anymore. He turned to me, his eyes cold and distant. "I think it's best if I head out tonight," he said flatly. "You can stay if you want. I'll find my way back." His words hit harder than I expected. "Are you sure?" I asked, struggling to find the right words, my heart tightening. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed somewhere behind me. "Yeah," he finally muttered, grabbing his bag and brushing past me without looking directly at me. His footsteps were heavy, and each step felt like a reminder of the distance that had opened up between us. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I knew he was leaving with a bitterness that would linger long after tonight. She appeared in the doorway, watching him, her face pale, her expression unreadable. "Take care," she said softly as he stepped outside. He gave her a brief nod, but his gaze was distant, almost hollow, as he walked down the path, fading into the night. A strange emptiness filled the cabin. The silence felt final, like he'd taken a piece of the room with him, leaving only the echo of everything that had just transpired. I felt a sharp twist of regret, knowing something had shifted between us, maybe irreparably. I turned to her, hoping for some sign of comfort, some way to make sense of all this. But her face was drawn, her eyes distant, as if she, too, was feeling the weight of what had just happened. She sighed, breaking the silence at last. "I never meant for any of this to go this far," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say to make any of this easier, nothing that could undo the events that had unfolded. She walked over to the fireplace, where the last embers flickered weakly, casting a soft glow across the room. She stood there for a moment, her gaze lost in thought, before turning back to face me. Her expression softened, tinged with regret. "I think we both need some space," she said quietly, her gaze meeting mine with an intensity that left no room for argument. This wasn't supposed to happen," she added, her voice thick with emotion. "Maybe it's better if we just leave it as it is." The words hung heavily in the air, final and thick with unspoken meaning. I nodded, the hollow feeling in my chest deepening, an ache that no words could soothe. The realization that this strange, intense experience would go unresolved left me with an inexplicable sadness. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain it all. But nothing came. As I gathered my things, preparing to leave, she watched me in silence, her own sadness mirroring mine. It felt as if we were both bracing for an ending neither of us had expected, one that neither of us had prepared for. I paused at the door, feeling her eyes on me. She took a step closer, her hand almost reaching out as if to bridge the gap that had formed between us. But then, she stopped, her hand falling slowly to her side. "Take care of yourself," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to meet her gaze as I stepped into the night. The chill of the evening air hit me like a slap as I left the warmth of the cabin behind. The darkness enveloped me, cold and heavy. I glanced back, half expecting to see her in the doorway, but the cabin remained still and silent. The quiet felt suffocating, filled with an emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. As I walked down the path, each step carried me farther from the cabin, but the feeling of being unfinished, of something left unresolved, clung to me. There were questions I hadn't asked, feelings I hadn't faced, and a strange sense of loss that I couldn't quite name. I thought of my friend, his quiet anger and confusion lingering in my mind. Could things ever go back to how they were? Could the past be undone? The lights of the cabin dimmed as I walked, leaving only the dark silhouettes of trees around me. I felt like I wasn't just leaving a place behind. It was as if I were walking away from a part of myself, from a fleeting piece I couldn't take back. The memory of her voice, the warmth of her touch, stayed with me, haunting me as I moved farther into the night. The silence was all-encompassing. The path stretched out in front of me, endless and uncertain. For a moment, I stopped, glancing back one last time. In the distance, I thought I saw a faint glow from the cabin window, a reminder of the strange, unspoken connection between us. But the light faded almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only darkness in its place. And in that moment, I understood that nothing would ever be the same. I had crossed an invisible line, and there was no turning back. The road ahead felt empty, filled with uncertainty, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever fully comprehend what had happened that night, or if it would remain a shadow, an unanswered question, that would linger in my mind forever. With each step, I felt the weight of everything left unsaid, a heavy ache growing with every distance I put between myself and the cabin.